Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this September 15, 2014 edition of Nightcast. Our opening story tonight, friends, 30 countries have pledged to help Iraq fight Islamic State militants by all means necessary. A joint statement by foreign ministers taking part in a major conference in Paris said support would include, quote, appropriate military assistance. You'll hear that in this opening video report. The talks had been called to agree to a strategy to combat the group which controls the group Islamic State, which controls large parts of Iraq and Syria. Frank Gardner has this opening report.
From 30 countries they came to Paris today, foreign ministers trying to thrash out a coherent strategy to confront the growing power of the so-called Islamic State.
Ce mouvement terroriste se joue des frontières.
This terrorist movement ignores borders and even claims to be a state. So this is a global threat and requires a global response.
The challenge for those countries lining up against the so-called Islamic State, or IS, is considerable. The shaded parts of the map here show the areas that it now controls. Over 6 million people are believed to be living under IS's rule. The CIA estimates that it has at least 30,000 fighters. The IS strategy has so far been lightning land grabs, then to consolidate its power. The Iraqi government feels the one most threatened.
This terrorist organization has killed old people, children, men and women. It wants to establish a state which will be a base for further action across the Middle East and the world.
This was Islamic State's most recent high-profile victim, David Haynes from Scotland, an aid worker beheaded by masked militants. Now they threaten to do the same to this man, Alan Henning, a British taxi driver from Salford, who came to Syria to help deliver aid to refugees.
We've considered every possible option to support these kidnapped victims, both British and others. And if we knew where they were, it would be a different story, but we don't know where they are.
Western leaders have been galvanized by the recent beheadings of US and British hostages. The US Secretary of State, John Kerry, has been racing around the region, putting together a coalition. The strategy for confronting Islamic State involves not just Iraq and the more moderate rebel groups in Syria, it's also pulling in all the neighbouring Arab states, because they now see IS as a threat to them as much as it is to the West. They'll be hosting bases for airstrikes, possibly joining in themselves and training Syrian rebels to fight the jihadists. Importantly, Arab governments are waging an ideological campaign to try to undermine IS's violent doctrine and choke off their supply of funds and recruits. It's too soon to know how the jihadists of Islamic State will react, but when world leaders meet at the UN next week, they will still be in place and probably for many months to come. Frank Gardner, BBC News.
And friends, related to what's going on in England, or I should say in the UK, related to the possible Scottish referendum to break off for Scotland to break off from the UK, the BBC does an interview with Sir Richard Branson, who told the BBC that a yes vote in the Scottish referendum could have catastrophic consequences for even Scotland and especially for England and the rest of the UK. Let's change this horse to the pale horse, because the pale horse includes Tatarake. It includes three things. Jesus Christ described what happened between the third seal of famine and the fifth seal of great tribulation. Let's throw the chart up on the screen just for a brief moment here early in the program. We've got these four horses of Revelation, they've often been referred to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Apocalypse is simply the Greek word for Revelation, the name of the book that John wrote on the Isle of Patmos, which, of course, was written by inspiration of Jesus Christ. And oftentimes, he's quoting Jesus Christ in the dream or the vision that John had on the Isle of Patmos, the apostle, early apostle and disciple, John. And these four horses with their four horsemen are very active right now. They are 4 of 7 seals of the book of Revelation, which have been opened by Jesus Christ now for our understanding since the birth and lifetime of Herbert W. Armstrong, through whom the opening of these seals was given by and from Jesus Christ to reveal who is the end time, who is and who was, and I say is still, even though Mr. Armstrong died physically in 1986, the preservation, let me come out just for a moment, friends, the preservation of Mr. Armstrong's writings and publications, of his speaking in radio broadcast, television broadcast, in Bible studies and sermons that were most of them recorded and have been well preserved and are available with a simple Google search all over the internet. So the open door of publishing and the open door of broadcasting that was opened during Mr. Armstrong's lifetime have been followed by the open door of the internet. And you know, friends, when Mr. Armstrong was alive, if someone wanted one of the booklets that Mr. Armstrong published, that he wrote oftentimes himself and published as the head of a great work, which Jesus Christ was doing, that Mr. Armstrong, in great humility, would often tell the brethren of the church that God called to help support Mr. Armstrong in doing the work that God did through Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Armstrong himself would often say, "Brethren, it wasn't me. I could have never have done this great work by myself. It was God doing this work. And I was simply an instrument who yielded himself 99.8 or 9% to God." I mean, you might as well call it 100%. Friends, he was just saying that he was still human and in the flesh. But God worked through the human flesh of Mr. Herbert Armstrong to do a great work. Many of you who watch this program now were called to support that work. And you knew Mr. Armstrong. Some of you, some few of you, amazingly, and it is amazing, have been born since Mr. Armstrong died, and yet you are able to be very aware of what Mr. Armstrong said because of the great preservation of the writing, the speaking of Mr. Armstrong, as it has been well preserved and is available. More, I was about to tell you, since Mr. Armstrong died, his writings and speakings are more readily available and accessible to people today than they were when Mr. Armstrong was alive. Because when Mr. Armstrong was alive, if you wanted to read one of the booklets that he wrote, if a friend of yours or if you yourself hadn't already written for the booklet, you would have to write in to get the booklet. You couldn't go out and buy them in a bookstore. They weren't for sale, except for just one book that he decided to reach that audience with, and he wrote one that was sold. And then later, maybe a second one that was sold. But the Incredible Human Potential was published through a publishing house and was available in bookstores. But otherwise, you had many libraries, most public libraries, were not carrying the publications of the work of God at that time when Mr. Armstrong was alive. A lot of them aren't carrying them now even. So you had to write in for a booklet when Mr. Armstrong was alive. And if you wanted to hear his broadcast, yes, he would be on daily, and many throughout the United States. You could just about pick him up on a radio station daily, but only for a half hour, just a half-hour radio talk that was addressed to the public. So he wouldn't always be saying a full ear's worth of, a full spiritual-minded head's worth of stuff, because he was addressing the public, who some were called and many were not called, but a witness was being given that way. But his Bible studies and sermons to the church are now accessible by anyone on demand, any hour of the day. You can Google them up, do a search engine search, find the recordings, and you could sit there and listen to recordings of Mr. Armstrong speaking 24 hours a day and spend a whole year and still not hear everything that has been preserved and recorded. And then by the time you have heard it all, you probably wouldn't well remember what you heard beginning when you began such a process. If anybody were to try to take that up, of course, that'd be kind of unbalanced, because the fourth command that tells us to stop and rest on the Sabbath does tell us to work 6 days. But of course, if someone made listening to Mr. Armstrong their work, if they were able to keep their family going or themselves going and do that, well, maybe they could make that their work. But I do know some who have been born since Mr. Armstrong died and have become very familiar with what he's preached, because they've really had a heart and enthusiasm for hearing what Mr. Armstrong has said. Now, on the other hand, there are many who were called when Mr. Armstrong was alive, and now they've gone off into some group somewhere, and they haven't heard Mr. Armstrong. Some people haven't heard Mr. Armstrong speak by recording or anything in a decade, which is a shame. But, friends, I got a lot of news stories for you tonight. I just wanted to I mainly stopped to point out that on these seals that God opened up through Mr. Herbert Armstrong, the fourth seal on this chart, the pale horse, Jesus Christ said during the time of this seal, three actualities would be occurring. They would be loimos, which means disease epidemics, pestilences, the plagues of Egypt. That's the primary activity of this deadly pale horse. It has a rider whose name is Death, and it is said in Revelation 6 that alongside this pale horse and its deadly rider, its rider named Death, rides or accompanies Hades, hell, the grave. And we mentioned the first of three activities, loimos, the disease epidemics, pestilence, plagues of Egypt. The second thing Christ mentioned would be happening in acceleration would be seismic activity. Commotions in the air, such as gale force winds of all kinds, hurricanes, typhoons, tornadoes, all of that kind of thing. Heavy excess rain causing floods, and then we're getting into commotions on the ground, and it gives the example of earthquakes, and of course seismic conditions on the ground. Commotions on the ground would include volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, flooding, which is big time in the news. We got a story related to that yet tonight, and other such calamities on the ground and in the air, commotions like that. And then the third element is terike, disturbance, troubled waters, both literally and figuratively, in the sense of mob seditions, disturbances. And so that's why I've switched the horse for this next story to the pale horse, because I think you could say what's going on in the UK with this potential Scotland pulling out of the UK following the referendum that vote concludes on Thursday of this week. This is now Monday night, so just 3 more days to go. And to hopefully offset that, Prime Minister David Cameron is in Scotland today speaking. We'll have a video on that after we hear from this businessman. I gave you his name a moment ago, Mr. Sir Richard Branson, who told the BBC that a yes vote in the Scottish referendum could have catastrophic consequences, he said. Sir Richard is a businessman, and he said that he thinks further devolution, no, not devolution, but the devolution of powers to Scotland, followed by another vote in around 10 years, he'll say in this video interview, he says would be a better choice. Earlier, Alex Salmond joined business leaders in Edinburgh to argue for Scottish independence as David Cameron prepares to outline head and heart reasons to vote no.
I would be disappointed if there was a yes vote. I mean, my wife is from Glasgow. My mum and many generations before her were from Edinburgh, and so we have close affiliations with Scotland and have done for many years. And I just emotionally feel it would be sad if Scotland was to separate. I mean, I think that Alex Salmond has done an absolute blinder in what he's achieved to date, and I think that for the sake of the Scottish people and the people below the border, it would be better if a lot more powers are devolved to Scotland, but that independence doesn't happen, because I think the consequences of independence are potentially quite catastrophic.
As a business person, how would it affect your view of investing in Scotland? I'm thinking particularly about the issue about which currency it may use.
The big problem about Scottish independence is there's just so many imponderables, and we just don't know, what the situation's going to be like afterwards. I mean, to me, it's a bit like a divorce. I mean, if you have a divorce, generally speaking, I think both sides get hurt, and it's best to try, not to have a divorce. And you've got a situation where only, the maximum, I think, is about 50% of Scottish people want this. I think the vast majority of people below the border don't want this to happen. And therefore, there's something like 50% of people in Scotland who don't want this. And so I think, at this stage, it would be better if you could actually have a situation where a lot more powers are devolved to Scotland, and then let the voters have another chance in 5 or 10 years' time to see whether that's worked or not. That's what's happened in Quebec. Quebec have stayed part of Canada. I was just there last week, and it seems to have worked for them. They've got the best of both worlds.
So you think if it's close vote, and if it is Devo Max as it's described, that let's see if that works for maybe a decade, and then let's have another test of independence with a referendum at that stage.
Yeah, but I think the Scottish people most likely will benefit the most by sort of saying, well, look, there's always a possibility we could do this again in 10 years' time. Give us everything we want, and I think they'll get most of what they want, but remain part of the greater community. I mean, the UK is a powerful group of group of nations, or whatever you call them, and to break that up, I think will weaken both Scotland and I think everybody south of the border.
And friends, Sir Richard there certainly made a point very well made as he compared what it would be like if Scotland leaves the UK to a divorce. And sometimes people divorce in the heat of anger, and they don't think it through about not only what they're doing to their mate, but they don't think about what they're doing to themselves either, to himself or herself, as they go through the divorce. So a good analogy here that I hope some people might think about if it were up to men, but depending on how God looks at how the citizens of the UK are doing with their regard or lack of regard for his law, may depend on whether God allows this or even helps to escalate it because of enemies being in the land who are able to vote. There are many people who are from Germany who have become dual citizens in the UK who are able to, and in Scotland, who are able to, and particularly in Scotland, because only Scotland can vote for this, citizens of Scotland, but there are some citizens of Scotland whose natural birth were in other countries, one of them Germany, with thousands of people from Germany there, who would love to see Scotland break off from the UK because their heart's really still in Germany. They still have that Assyrian blood in them. But if the nation, the citizens of the UK, are doing as many of at least the government and citizens too of the United States in disobeying their creator and allowing laws to be passed, such as I mentioned last night, I've mentioned it several times the past week. I know it makes some of you who like these perverse laws angry with me for bringing it out in this way. But friends, it causes the wrath of God to come on a nation when we disobey Him, and same-sex marriage is not something God is pleased with by any means. It is disobedience. It's ignoring the discernment of His Word that says that is an abomination to God. It is perversion. And it causes what God says in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28 to happen. God starts off with the blessings, the good things, saying that if you obey me, I'll pour out all these blessings on both you as individuals and you collectively as a nation, especially those nations that are of the descendants of Joseph, Ephraim, the UK, Manasseh, the United States. He says, I'll bless the fruit trees in your backyard with an abundance of rain, but not too much rain that would cause mildew and bad things to happen. I'll give you the right amount of rain. Your fruit won't dry up from lack of rain. It won't mildew from too much rain or get the blight from too much rain and other things like that. On the other hand, God says, if after I've punished you because you're not obeying, I'll punish you 7 times more, and then if you still have your heart bent on disobeying me, then, as He says in Leviticus 26, verse 19, He says, then I will break the pride of your power. Let me read it right here out of the Bible. He says, and if you will not yet for all this hearken. Did I say verse 19 of Leviticus 26? Starting in verse 18, and if you will not yet hearken after I do the curses on you, unto me, then I'll punish you 7 times more for your sins. And verse 19, I will break the pride of your power. If Scotland breaks off from the UK, that'll be a fulfillment in part of that verse, because the pride of UK power, just let the UK try to negotiate what's left of the UK. Try to negotiate with the EU if Scotland breaks out of England. Now, before I go to our next video that shows you something about the oil of Scotland and what a loss it'll be to the UK if they lose Scotland and that oil. That video is coming next. But I mentioned, friends, just before this video, I mentioned to you about an open door that was open to Mr. Armstrong with publishing and with radio broadcasting, something that was invented during the lifetime of Mr. Herbert Armstrong. And God opened those doors as radio stations were, some of them only broadcast with 100 watts, like KORE up in Oregon, on which Mr. Armstrong had the door open to him to do, first of all, a small program once a week on Sunday mornings, which no other minister wanted. He had that free. And then because the mail that was coming in from that program was significant, the radio station owner said, hey, you should be on more often, and you should purchase some radio time, be on there every day. Mr. Armstrong went on in faith, and from there opened up the Liberty Radio Network up in the northwest of the United States, and then thereafter God opened the doors to some big 50,000 watt stations in the United States and a 100,000 watt station out of Mexico and some of those 50,000 watt stations in the United States were clear channel stations that, especially one in the middle of the United States, that just about blanketed and from all the stations that had the big 50,000 watt power that Mr. Armstrong was on, that he was covering the entire nation. So God opened the door of broadcasting, He opened the door of publishing to Mr. Armstrong, and printing presses, and the development of the printing presses during Mr. Armstrong's lifetime was amazing. But And that open door, let me read that to you. And I was going to say, but since Mr. Armstrong died, an even bigger door was opened with the internet. And you can get almost all of Mr. Armstrong's broadcasts and publications on the internet, on demand, anytime you want them. So the point is this: even though Mr. Armstrong is in the grave, it doesn't mean his work has finished. It's the work God did through Mr. Armstrong is more available right now than it was when he was alive. When he was alive, he would have to come up with these, work hard and study. And, of course, God inspire him and show him things, but he had to work. Now all these things are preserved. You don't have to wait till he does them. They're done. In fact, it's a difficult job. If you want to hear everything Mr. Armstrong said, you'd have to spend hours and 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 hours listening to hear it all. And then you still might miss something, because sometimes you hear something once, and if it's of a spiritual nature, unless God's really giving you His Spirit, it might fly right over your head. And even if you've got a lot of God's Spirit, it might fly right over your head the first time. You listen to it again, and you say, wow, hey, I got something different out of it this time that I didn't get before. One reason for that is because things that are spiritual are always new. And I'm quoting Mr. Armstrong as I say that. He said that in at least one of his sermons, referring to how God says in His words certain things are new. And Mr. Armstrong pointed out, why are they new? Because he said things that are spiritual are always new. They are dynamic. God and His Spirit, God through His Spirit is sometimes and oftentimes working with an individual. And if you need this or that, by His Spirit, God can. God's in control of that Spirit. It's not something that just operates on its own. It's a vehicle. It's a power. It's in a vehicle more powerful than any computer than a human can program. God can program that Spirit. But it's God programming it. It's God's will that's programming that Spirit and maybe working you, and God can always intervene like anybody on a computer, on a program. The developer of the program can intervene on it and rewrite the code, even, or write new things in it and have it do this or that it wasn't doing before. He's in control of it. So God, through His Spirit, can cause you to understand things, this or that He wants you to get that maybe you wouldn't have, some other person is not getting because they don't need that, but you do. I'm just giving you an example of some of the things Mr. Armstrong explained to us about how God and His Spirit works. But I want to read you out of Revelation 3, verse 7 real quickly. To the angel of the church in Philadelphia, write, these things saith He that's holy, He that is true, and He that hath the key of David, He that openeth, and no man shutteth, and shutteth, and no man opens. No man openeth. So there's one verse where God talks about the open door, and there are other verses that actually mention open door that God did for the work that God did through Mr. Armstrong. But that door has not closed, friend. That door is still open. It's still open big time, even bigger. The door's open even wider and bigger now that God has allowed or caused the internet to come about. Something that, as publishing came about, God used that to bring His truth through Mr. Armstrong. As broadcasting, first radio and then television opened up, God used that, opened that door for for God to bring His truth to us through Mr. Armstrong. Now that the internet is open, Mr. Armstrong's writings and speakings are there on demand. That's the point I wanted to make. Now, I got several more stories. We're going to go overtime tonight because, friends, there are reasons I felt inspired to speak up to bring those of us who are in harmony with what God has done and is yet doing through Mr. Armstrong. And God told us Himself, and Mr. Armstrong hired people to pay attention. Their whole job was to be like Mr. Hogberg, Gene Hogberg, his whole job. And he had other people worked in his department with him. And they had the UPI and AP teletypes at that time that spewed paper out, just constantly sending news across teletypes before we had these modern internet devices and smartphones and method of just being able to get things, boom, through internet. But before that, news came across old teletype machines. Every television radio station had these AP or UPI or both of the teletype machines running, and the work had these AP and UPI machines in the office of Mr. Gene Hogberg, who kept his eye on things and would pull the most pertinent things, Mr. Hogberg having been trained in Ambassador College by Mr. Armstrong. And Mr. Hogberg would keep Mr. Armstrong informed about, hey, Mr. Armstrong, here's what's just come in the news today about what's happening over here. And in doing that, friends, Mr. Armstrong was following what Christ instructed in Luke 21, verse 36, where Christ told us to watch and pray always, and then offers us a promise that if you do that, that you may be accounted worthy to escape the things that are coming. Now, Mr. Armstrong could see certain things were coming in Europe in the way of the political union of the coming together of a United States of Europe that has come together in the form of what's now called an EU, a United Europe. But that's going to reshape. That's eventually going to be 10 nations or regions, and borders may be changed to accomplish the 10, 5 from the east, 5 from the west, giving their power to one dictator, one emperor, who will most likely be an Assyrian, who will be crowned in Frankfurt, Germany, in a coronation ceremony conducted by the Pope. Maybe not the current Pope, maybe the current Pope, maybe the one living in the Vatican that retired last year and a half ago, who may come out of the closet at some future point, or maybe someone else entirely. We don't know that yet. We watch and we pray and we see how things go every day, as Jesus Christ told us to do, and be an active part of the news by praying about it. Now, Mr. Armstrong would have been amazed, maybe beside himself, if he were alive right now today, to see not only the political union more fully coming together with what's going to be the United States of Europe and this EU thing, and a political union, but Mr. Armstrong mentioned there were 2 more things that would need to happen. There would need to be an economic union. That didn't happen while Mr. Armstrong was alive. That began Helmut Kohl, toward the end of Helmut Kohl's reign of power in Germany as the chancellor. In 1999, they began circulating the euro in a bookkeeping way. There was no money printed. They just developed the euro as a bookkeeping function. Then in late 2000 or early 2001, I have to go back and look at that, exactly when they printed the money, printed the euro, and started circulating it. That was right at the beginning of the what are we now? We're now 2012. In 2000. So just as we went into the year 2000, end of 2000, beginning of 2001, that euro went into circulation. So that was the beginning of an economic union, as nation after nation began to convert their own currency over to the euro, so that one monetary system, little by little, came about, so that there are now, out of the 28 nations that are part of the EU, how many of them is it that are part of the Eurozone? There's a distinction. There are some countries that are part of the EU, 28 of them, but only, 17, 18, 19, 20 of them are part of the Eurozone. The term Eurozone, having the word euro in it, is a clue for you to figure it out and say, oh, these are the countries within the EU that have converted their currency over to the euro. The UK, for example, is part of the EU, but the UK has not converted its currency, at least not yet, over to the euro. And so, therefore, even though the UK is part of the EU, the UK is not part of the Eurozone, because the UK does not use the euro as its own. Let me rephrase that and say it this way. The UK has not replaced its own currency with the euro. The UK, you can use the euro in the UK, but you got to you got to do it by conversion, because they still circulate the British pound sterling as the currency of the country of the UK. And in that economic union, a lot of the nations that had a problem with their loan to GDP ratio, which is a requirement of the EU that you keep it within a certain boundary, they went through a lot of struggle, and some of them went through an austerity because they were in deep trouble. They had to borrow money, and they borrowed it mostly from Germany, and the debtor is slave to the lender. And so that's escalated the role of Germany, as Germany in its disciplined, work hard culture was able to bail out a lot of these countries that didn't have the discipline they needed, and it's put Germany on top. Now the third union that Mr. Armstrong said is needed is a military union. And that's about to come together as we have these big crises in Europe and the Middle East. The crisis with the Ukraine and Russia. Russia just practically going to war with Europe over this. And with the Islamic State crisis in the Middle East suddenly raising an ugly head and finding out that it has triple the number of soldiers and personnel in the Islamic State militant regime than was initially thought. Instead of 10,000, they're finding out it's 30,000 and growing. And so this may help countries come together and pull their militaries together, especially as they see either NATO not do it, or EU will take over NATO and kick the United States out of it, the waffling United States out of it eventually, when they finally see that the leader of the United States, how do I say this? You heard him yourself last night and last week in the videos we played, where the President of the United States stood there in his speech related to the subject, said that ISIL, and he referred to them as, he knows that means Islamic State also, because he made a reference to that, and so they call themselves Islamic State. He says, but ISIL is not Islamic. As some of us nearly fell backwards out of our chair as we heard him say that. ISIL, the Islamic State, is not Islamic. Excuse me? Do you think we're dummies, or is there something askew up here? And then following that statement last week by the United States President, the Prime Minister of the UK, in a speech yesterday, we played that last night, he stands there and he says, Islam is a peaceful religion. Excuse me, somebody missing something somewhere? Do you not realize the book, the Bible, to a Muslim? A Muslim is someone by definition who practices the Islam religion. The Bible of the Islam religion is the Quran, and in the Quran, you can Google it up online. Friends, I won't waste a whole lot more time on this tonight. You can see verse after verse in the Quran that says an infidel should be killed, and with permission by the Quran to kill them in the worst way, murder them in the worst way. It's considered an act of that'll get you rewards in heaven. But friends, let's go on with this report now. We're going to be doing an hour report tonight to get all our news stories in. Did I read that verse to you? I did. I read that verse from Revelation 3:7. It talks about an open door, and the door is open even more fully to hear what God said through his servant. And some of us repeat those things. And Luke 21:36, I was about to read that one to you. I kind of quoted it to you where Christ said that he instructed us to watch and pray always. Mr. Armstrong said a good example of doing that. And hear the verse. Watch you, therefore. Now, therefore follows Christ having expounded these seals of Revelation. I'll pull the chart forward just real quickly. He explained in plain language in Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13, the conditions, the elements, the actualities of the white horse being deception. Let no man deceive you. Many will come in my name saying, I am Christ, and yet will deceive many. That being his plain language definition, explanation of the first seal, which is depicted in Revelation as a white horse. Then Christ said there would be wars and rumors of war. Plain language definition, explanation of the second seal, depicted in Revelation as a red horse. Christ said there would be famine. Plain language, a scarcity of food. A plain language definition of the third seal, depicted as a black horse in Revelation. And Christ said there would be loimus, disease epidemics, pestilence, the plagues of Egypt. There would be seismus, seismic activity, commotions in the air, commotions on the ground. There would be tarache, disturbances, troubled water, mobs, sedition. All of that happening between the third and fifth seal, being part of the fourth seal, which is depicted in Revelation as a pale horse with a rider named Death, alongside whom rides Hades, hell, the grave. Now, after Christ explained the activities of those four horses in plain language, he said, watch you, therefore, in Luke 21:36, again, after he explained the activities of those four horses and the four horsemen of the apocalypse, Revelation, he said, watch the activities of these horses in daily world news. Watch and pray always. And if you do that, he said, there's a reward, that you may be accounted worthy to escape. To escape what? The next seal, the next major event in prophecy is the fifth seal, the great tribulation and affliction and the killing of saints, the martyrdom of saints. And it'll be a time of World War III. It'll be the time of the revival of the old Holy Roman Empire. It'll be the time when an emperor is coronated is crowned by the Pope in a coronation ceremony held in Frankfurt, Germany, in the Emperor's Hall. That's where they always have done it. And as I've pointed out many times, even though that Emperor's Hall in Frankfurt, Germany was bombed by the Allies toward the end of World War II, the Marshall Plan of the United States, you people in the United States with your tax dollars through the Marshall Plan, rebuilt the Emperor's Hall in Frankfurt, Germany for the Germans and for all of Europe, so that that Emperor's Hall would be ready for the fifth seal to culminate, to be commenced to revive out of the pit, where the head of it, the seventh and final head of the Holy Roman Empire, could be crowned by the Pope. Pope always does that. The biblical thing is backed up by the facts of history. Emperor after emperor. You can see their statues and their portraits that have been replaced in this new since the end of World War II, Emperor's Hall in Frankfurt, Germany. They've replenished that hall with portraits and statues of all the emperors who've reigned up until this time. And there'll be another head to be put in that Emperor's Hall. It'll be the seventh and final head when he's coronated, when he's crowned there by the Pope in a coronation ceremony to place that crown on his head and begin the revival of the old Holy Roman Empire. That'll be the beginning and the fulfillment of the fifth seal, that part of which is the Great Tribulation, time of World War III, martyrdom of God's saints. It'll be the time of the two witnesses of God. That's using the open door of the satellite, and however God has people of the whole world see their witness. That'll be done for 3.5 years during the Great Tribulation. And of course they go on when we get into the sixth seal, the heavenly signs, and the seventh seal, beside these Let me bring this forward, as long as we're talking about this. Beside this, these 6 seals up to the heavenly signs, there's a 7th seal. And in between the 6th seal and the 7th seal, 144,000 are sealed by God to be protected by God from the 7th seal. Now, the 5th seal is the time of Satan's wrath during the Great Tribulation. It's still part of, the first 6 seals are still part of the days of man and Satan. Some who think that the Great Tribulation, oh, that's the wrath of God. Oh, no, it's not. That's the wrath of Satan. He goes up to fight with God a second time. God throws him back to the earth. He's angry. He knows he has but a short time. He goes after the church of God. God protects his saints who have been accounted worthy to escape, and Satan nonetheless chases after them, but God causes a great flood to keep him from being able to harm those who are accounted worthy to escape. And then Satan goes after the remnant who are persecuted during the time of the Great Tribulation, and that'll go 2.5 years. The 2 witnesses will be about during that time. Then there will be the heavenly signs. 144,000 will be sealed to be protected from the 7th seal, which consists of 7 trumpets. The 7th trumpet consists of 7 last plagues, and that's all part of that 7th seal that's called the Day of the Lord, a day being in prophecy as a year. And so that's considered to be deemed as a 1-year time period, the Day of the Lord. So you'll have 2.5 years of Great Tribulation, then a year of the Day of the Lord with the pouring out of plagues. None of that being a happy time to be living unless you are accounted worthy to escape it. And friends, I hope that those of you watching this program are accounted worthy, and you very likely are if you're watching a program like this one or one like it, because God says if you watch news that relates to these 4 seals, which is what we paid most attention to on this program. Once in a while we'll throw in a light story, but mostly we watch the things that relate to these four seals. And if you're doing that, and praying, you can't just watch now. You've got to also pray and become an active part of the news things you see. God says if you do that, you may be accounted worthy to escape the 5th seal, the Great Tribulation, and the 7th seal, the Day of the Lord, where God pours out his plagues upon men who've taken the mark of the beast. All right, now, we went into a lot of Bible tonight, friends, and I got a few more stories yet to play, and we're going to make this a 1-hour report. Let's finish up. We got to finish up with news now. In this next story that still relates to Scotland that we've covered so far, and I've got some different news right after that we'll whip through. But in this report from the 1975 archive, I think this will be valuable to you, because this report shows how the discovery of oil beneath the North Sea changed the dynamic of the debate over Scottish independence. This video clip is taken from a panorama special called Coming Apart, The Devolution Debate, Part 1. This was first broadcast on November 17 in 1975. Let's give a listen.
Until 2 years ago, Scotland's economic problems made most hard-headed Scots reject any ideas of independence. But then came oil. It was the propagandist's dream. The discovery of oil was like finding a hoard of sunken treasure for Scotland and for the Nationalist Party. In England, it's called North Sea oil. North of the border, nearly everyone calls it Scotland's oil. As much as anything, it led to growing support for the Scottish National Party, and it's also one of the main reasons why any British government is likely to oppose full independence for Scotland. For without the promise of oil in a year or two, who would be lending Britain money now? The nationalist oil claim has the virtue of simplicity. If Scotland were independent, all the oil north of a line stretching out from the border would be Scottish in international law. Dr. Bill Miller, a Scottish political analyst, has just finished a survey of political attitudes in Scotland. Do all Scots regard the oil as their own?
In Scotland, there's a wide range of views. Something like a third of Scots feel they should get the lion's share of the North Sea oil revenues. Something like a third of Scots is willing to concede the English standpoint that it must be shared on a British basis.
What part do you think that the discovery of oil played in the rise of nationalism and the demand for devolution in Scotland?
Well, there's always been an interest in devolution in Scotland, and certainly there's always been a feeling of national identity in Scotland. But until the discovery of oil, there was a tendency for the political expression of that, expressed in election results, to die away as general elections approached. The Nationalists did fairly well in by-elections, they did fairly well in local elections, but come the day of the general election, their support tended to evaporate. What was new after the discovery of North Sea oil and the exploitation of North Sea oil was that their support did not evaporate in February of last year.
North Sea oil has transformed the Scottish National Party. Before its discovery, the economic case for independence was weak. But oil changed things almost overnight. The party began to attract not just the political opportunists, but the politically able as well. The British as a whole might have lost an empire and not found a role, but an increasing number of Scots thought that Scotland's role was now independence.
Okay, friends, I thought that might be valuable to some of you. And some of the things that I've been covering tonight, friends, even though it might be like preaching to the choir, you know, say, hey, wait a minute, this is the choir. We're here. We're with you. We're watching world news. Why don't you get to it? Well, some of you who have your kids watch, it may be good for them once in a while if we cover some things like I covered tonight. Friends, for some reason I had heavy inspiration on me to do that. And for some reason God's given me more strength tonight than I've had in the last week while I was sick with a virus and throwing up some and very, very weak. Struggled to do some of these live stream broadcast programs the last few nights. I just was weakened greatly, but thankfully God's given me a little more strength. Now, if God allows the UK to be divided, severed because of Scotland pulling out, and the UK being greatly weakened, and the pride of its power being greatly weakened, that will also serve and work against the United States, because without a powerful ally like Britain in Europe, as Europe comes together more strongly and strengthens its muscle against American interest, as eventually you'll see a hatred of the tribes of Israel inside of Europe. Eventually that'll also work against Brother Reuben, France. You'll see that. And yet right now, Europe needs England. It needs Brother Reuben. It needs Brother Ephraim. Ephraim, though, if Ephraim becomes weaker, the UK, Ephraim will not be as valuable to the EU. And so, and eventually that'll affect Brother Reuben too, because he'll get in trouble with the EU eventually. But let's keep our focus on Britain for a moment, because there's, in the news today, there's more trouble with Britain and its pride and its power with this story about how 2 British tourists have been killed in an attack on a beach in southern Thailand, according to local police. David Miller, 24, from Jersey, and Hannah Witheridge, 23, from Norfolk, were attacked last night, on the island of Koh Tao. Both the victims had suffered serious injuries. Police are questioning tourist and hotel and bar owners. Jonathan Head has this report from Bangkok.
A tropical beach and now a crime scene. Police reinforcements were rushed to this normally peaceful island to help investigate what appears to be a brutal double murder. The bodies of the 2 young British tourists were found here early this morning. At first, islanders tried to block people from leaving in the hope of finding the perpetrator. But the police say they're looking to question a tourist they believe left this morning. The 2 victims have both been identified as David Miller, who was 24, from Jersey, and Hannah Witheridge, 23, from Hemsby in Norfolk. They're both thought to have arrived on the island last month. Koh Tao lies in the Gulf of Thailand and is popular with divers. It has a reputation of being quieter and less developed than other islands. have now been murdered here since 2009.
Pakistan has claimed the life of a groom who was traveling to his wedding reception on a boat. 16 others on the boat also died when the vessel sank on the swollen Chenab River in central Punjab.
Zahid Ali and some guests were on board a boat for a reception in the central city of Multan. But the boat capsized and the groom drowned along with 16 others. Officials said the crowded boat was crossing the swollen river Chenab in central Punjab, one of the worst flood-hit areas in Pakistan. The bride said she survived by grabbing an electricity pole.
My parents told my in-laws to wait until the floodwaters had gone down. Don't go, they said. But my husband's family said, everyone's going on the boats. Let's go. That's why we left.
The bodies of the victims, including that of the groom Zahid Ali, were taken to a Multan hospital ahead of their burial. The family had been warned about the dangerously high waters, but officials said they went ahead anyway. The floodwaters in the Multan area were at their height at the weekend, with the Pakistani army dropping much-needed relief supplies. More than 300 people have died in Pakistan in the floods so far. And with the water now moving to the southern Sindh province, authorities are watching closely to see if they'll have another crisis on their hands. Shaima Khalil, BBC News, Islamabad.
Okay, friends, and one more story here tonight that would actually relate to that pale horse. You could say this actually even relates to the, let's put the white horse up. Let's relate this next story to that. It could relate to either one of them because of what's involved in this story. Rescuers in Nigeria are continuing the search for survivors among the rubble of a collapsed church building in Lagos. At least 40 people died after the two-story guest house for members of the Synagogue Church of All Nations collapsed on Friday. Well-known preacher T.B. Joshua has released closed-circuit television footage showing the moment of the collapse.
The search for survivors carried on through the weekend, although today chances of finding any more are slim. Rubble is all that's left of the building, which was said to house foreign visitors to a mega church led by the preacher T.B. Joshua. It's not known how many people were inside the guest house when it collapsed. Rescue officials point to problems with construction.
It was a guest house. It was a 4-story building with a foundation of 4-story building, but later it was converted to 6-story building without a change on the foundation.
This collapse brings into question the standards of construction in this overcrowded city. As land in Lagos is already expensive, more and more people are putting up multi-story buildings. The popular televangelist distributed this CCTV footage to the press. It shows the moment the guest house collapsed. T.B. Joshua claims a small aircraft flew around the area 4 times before the building caved in. He links this to the deadly collapse, suggesting it was a possible attack on him.
And friends, one last story tonight that relates to leaders of the world. You know, we're told to pray for those who are in power. And in this last story for the evening, we'll see how a center-left coalition led by the Social Democrats have won Sweden's parliamentary elections, which means it signals the end of Prime Minister Fredrik Reinfeldt's conservative government, which has been in power for 8 years, and will mean a new Prime Minister in Sweden. Lars Bavanger reports from Stockholm.
Sweden's next Prime Minister, Stefan Löfven, a trade union boss who became Social Democrat leader only 2 years ago. On Sunday, his centre-left bloc secured nearly 44% of the vote.
Tonight, Sweden has told us that we need a change and that we need a different approach. And my most important message tonight is that I'm ready to explore the possibilities of forming a new government for Sweden.
It ends 8 years of Fredrik Reinfeldt's centre-right coalition, which cut taxes and privatised parts of the country's education and health services. It's a return to normality of sorts for Sweden. The country's had a social democrat as prime minister for 60 of the past 80 years.
Sign off. I went a long time tonight for this Monday edition of Nightcast. God willing and the creek don't rise, friends. We'll be back again tomorrow night, Tuesday night. Look forward to seeing you, God willing, tomorrow night on Nightcast. Until next time, your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.